Welcome back to the English Prep Podcast, everyone. We're going to be diving deep into something that I know a lot of English learners find really tricky, and that's listening comprehension. It's one thing to learn all the vocabulary and the grammar, but then when you actually have to listen to people talking, especially, for those big exams like the IELTS or TOEFL or the PTE, it can feel like a totally different challenge.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you can know tons of words, you can ace your grammar quizzes, but then you get into a real-world situation or even just the listening section of one of those tests, and suddenly it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Accents, speed, even just background noise can throw you off completely.
Exactly. It's not just about the words themselves. It's understanding what the speaker is actually trying to get across, the meaning behind the words. And that can be tough. And I think for a lot of our listeners who are, prepping for those exams, that listening section can feel like a really big hurdle.
It is a hurdle, no doubt about it. But it's also a skill that's so important, not just for tests, but for actually using English out there in the real world. I mean, think about it. If you're talking to friends, if you're studying in English, if you're working, strong listening skills make such a difference. It's how you connect with people.
Yeah, it's so true. So today, we're going to break down why listening can be so hard. And more importantly, give you some really practical tips for getting better at it.
We're going to cover ways to kind of train your ear and your mind to become a more effective listener, both for those exams and for real-world communication, because both are super important.
All right, so let's start with the basics. Why is listening so hard, especially for English learners?
Well, I think a big part of it is just the sheer variety out there in English. I mean, there's so many different accents, so many ways of speaking.
Oh, yeah. I remember when I was first starting to learn, I was so used to one particular accent, and then I'd hear someone else speak, and it's like I had to start all over again.
And then on top of that, you have the speed, right? People speak fast, they link words together. Sometimes it feels like they're eating their words.
It can be tough to keep up, for sure. And then you mentioned background noise earlier, which can be another big distraction.
Oh, yeah. Especially in those test scenarios, they love to throw in some extra sounds to make it harder, so you have to kind of learn to filter that stuff out.
Okay, so we've got these challenges. What can our listeners actually do to improve? Let's talk about some practical strategies.
Well, one thing I always suggest is to really think about your practice environment.
You mean where you're studying?
Exactly. It can make a huge difference. Having a quiet space where you can really focus, that's key. No TV blaring in the background, no phone buzzing, just you and the audio.
Right. Got to minimize those distractions. And speaking of the audio, does the quality of your headphones matter?
It does. Good quality headphones can make it so much easier to pick up on the subtle things in someone's voice. The tone, the intonation, those things carry a lot of meaning.
So it's worth investing in a decent pair of headphones.
Absolutely. I'd say that's a good investment for your English learning journey.
Okay, so we've got the environment sorted. What about the actual listening itself? Any tips for making it more effective?
Well, a big one is to be an active listener, not a passive one.
What do you mean by that?
So instead of just letting the audio wash over you, try to engage with it. Take notes. Try to predict what's coming next. Summarize what you've heard.
Ah, that's interesting. So break it down. What are some specific techniques people can use?
Well, like I said, note-taking is a classic. Don't try to write down every single word, though. Just jot down key ideas, maybe some keywords that stand out to you.
So it's like your own personal shorthand.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And as you practice more, you'll develop your own system that works for you.
Okay, what about predicting what's coming next? How do you do that?
Well, a lot of times there'll be some context given before you listen to something, like a title, maybe an intro question, or a little description of the topic. Use that information to your advantage.
So kind of get your brain ready for what you're about to hear.
Right. Think about what vocabulary might be used, what kind of information you might expect to hear. It really primes your brain and makes it easier to follow along.
I like that. Okay, so we've taken notes, we've predicted. What's next?
Summarizing. After you've listened to something, take a minute to tell yourself, or even better, tell someone else what you just heard. Put it in your own words. It helps you process the information, make sure you really understood it.
I guess that's especially useful if you're studying with a partner, right? You can kind of quiz each other.
Exactly. And it's not just about remembering specific facts, but really understanding the main idea, the overall message. That's often what those exams are testing.
So we've talked a lot about the how of listening practice, but what about the what? What are some good resources that our listeners can use?
Oh, there are so many good ones out there these days.
Like, where should people start?
Well, podcasts are a great option. They're free, there's a huge variety of topics, and you can listen to them pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, podcasts are definitely a good one. What about audiobooks?
Audiobooks are fantastic too, especially if you're someone who likes to read. It's a different way to engage with stories, and you get that exposure to different voices and accents.
Right. And while we're talking about, like, entertainment, what about movies and TV shows?
Oh, those are fantastic for learning too, especially for getting used to everyday English, the way people actually talk in casual situations.
Yeah, but it could be tough if they speak really fast.
True. It might take some getting used to. Start with something you're already familiar with, maybe even watch with subtitles at first if that helps, then gradually challenge yourself to listen without them.
Okay, so we've got podcasts, audiobooks, movies, TV shows. Anything else we're missing?
Well, if you're specifically preparing for those exams, definitely look for practice materials that are designed for those tests.
You mean like practice tests?
Yeah, and there are websites and apps that have exercises specifically focused on listening comprehension, often with different question types, just like you'd see on the real exams.
So a really good mix of resources out there to keep things interesting and engaging.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about those exams specifically. IELTS, TOEFL, PTE. What should our listeners keep in mind as they're preparing for those listening sections?
Well, first off, know your test.
Meaning?
Meaning understand the format of the listening section for the specific exam you're taking. They're not all the same. Some are more focused on conversations, others have lectures. The question types can vary.
So, do your research, know what to expect.
Exactly. The more familiar you are with the format, the less stressed you'll be on test day. And another thing, practice time management.
Oh yeah, those exams are all timed, aren't they?
They are, and you often don't get to replay the audio. So get used to listening efficiently and answering questions quickly. Don't dwell too long on any one question.
That's good advice for life in general, too, not just exams.
So true. And then the other thing we talked about earlier, that variety of accents, that's really important for exam prep, too.
Yeah, they might throw a British accent at you, then an American accent, then Australian.
Exactly. So during your practice, don't just stick to one type of English. Listen to as many different accents as you can. There are tons of resources online for that.
So expose your ears to all the different ways English is spoken around the world. It'll pay off in the long run.
It definitely will.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Any last words of wisdom for our listeners who are working on their listening skills?
You know, just remember, it's a process. It takes time and effort. Don't get discouraged if you don't see improvement overnight.
It's a journey, not a sprint.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the more confident you'll become. You'll start to notice those little improvements, like understanding a fast speaker or catching a tricky word you wouldn't have before. And those little wins will keep you motivated.
And I think it's also important to make it enjoyable, right? Don't just force yourself to listen to boring stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Choose topics that genuinely interest you. Whether it's podcasts, movies, audiobooks, whatever, find something that keeps you engaged.
Because if you enjoy it, you're more likely to stick with it.
Exactly.
All right, so that's our deep dive into listening comprehension for English learners. Hopefully you found this helpful, and maybe it even sparks some new ideas for your own learning routine.
And remember, if you have any questions or if you want to share some of your favorite listening resources, feel free to leave a comment below.
We love hearing from you. Until next time, keep listening and keep learning.